Gives me great pleasure to welcome Stefan Wager to give a talk here at Cornell. So this is not the first time he's been at ORIE, but the first time I've actually overlapped with him visiting ORIE. So Stefan is a faculty member in the Operations Information Technology group at Stanford's GSB. And he's basically spent all his time at Stanford. He started there as an undergraduate, then continued for graduate school, was still not unconvinced by the place and continued on after that. Anyway, so that's the nice part of the introduction. What I want to briefly tell you is, okay, why exactly do we have him speaking here? And especially, I've actually never met Stefan before, so why exactly have I invited him? And one clue to this effect is this is actually not the only paper of Stefan's which is being presented at Cornell this semester. So there are 3 separate talks this semester alone, which are based on papers which he's involved with. So some of you may have attended the talk given by Dean Eccles back in February in the CAM seminar. That was a work that Stefan was part of. And then in a few weeks, we'll be having Kwang Shu attending, who's also going to be speaking about work that he's involved with. And in case you think this is sort of coincidental, my experience has been over like the last 5 years or so. Stefan's work sort of keeps popping up all over the place when you least expect it. So I know we tried to get him here back in 2015 to give a talk and maybe convince him to leave Stanford, but we couldn't do so. And people were pretty disappointed not to hear him. And then since then, a lot of my collaborators every once in a while sort of interact with him and then can't stop talking about him. So I had this experience with Zhengguan Zhu, who was a collaborator of Stefan's as well, with Theodoros Doukaris, who visited the GSB and just couldn't stop talking about Stefan. And then last semester, my student Sean was at Simons, and ever since then, whenever we start discussing something, he keeps mentioning, oh yes, there was a reading group where Stefan explained it to us. And since then, I completely understood it. So at some point, I realized Stefan's clearly doing something really good and being able to explain it much better than anyone else in the field. So I figured I also want to get into the act, and that's why we have him here. So feel free to go ahead and tell us about sequential experiments.
Well, thanks for the introduction. It's a pretty high bar. I hope I can live up to even a small part of what you're hoping out of this. But anyways, yeah, thanks also for the invitation. It's great to see all of you, and I guess I really wish I could come visit in person and kind of meet everyone and have longer conversations. But I guess that's not in the cards for now. So it's still very nice to be able to see everyone remotely. So today's talk, like I mentioned, it's joint work with my colleague Kwang, and it's about diffusion asymptotics for sequential experiments. So with the sequential experiment, I think this is probably a pretty familiar setup for people here. So I'll go through this quickly. Let's say you're into plants and you just adopted a calathea, and you're wondering, in order to take care of it, should you give it 1 or 2 cups of water when you water it? Let's say also that you were obsessed with data analysis and didn't like reading plant care blogs that'll just tell you. Well, then there are things you could do. You could run a randomized trial. For the first 100 times you water the plant, flip a coin to decide how much water you give it and see which watering regime the plant preferred. That might seem a little dogmatic. You could also do something sequential, for example, Thompson sampling, which would be kind of you maintain beliefs about which watering strategy is better, and you kind of put some randomness in which watering strategy you use, but you prefer the watering strategy that you believe is better based on your current knowledge. This seems eminently reasonable for this, this problem setting, and kind of not surprisingly, methods like Thompson sampling and other methods of sequential learning that update when alternative you explore as you collect more data are quite popular. And there's this specific example. I don't know if any of you have experienced growing calatheas. If yes, you'd know that this is obviously a trick question. You don't just give a calathea 1 or 2 cups of water. You need to spritz it. It's a jungle plant, and you need to spritz it with water every day, twice a day. But all right, there are other plants for which this question might be more relevant. So anyways, this is a type of problems I want to talk about today. Essentially sequential experiments in the following kind of k-armed bandit model. There's a sequence of decision points labeled I from 1 up to n. And at each step I, you have an agent. The agent chooses an action, one capital K actions, and then observes a reward. So far, so good. We're going to be in a stochastic setting, which means that each action has a reward distribution, PK. So once you've chosen action AI, you observe rewards drawn from the distribution PAI, and these draws kind of are independent draws from this distribution. So kind of there's dependence between what you see based on what actions you choose. Otherwise, you observe independent draws from these distributions. And right, the important thing about this model is that your actions can depend on past observations, so you can learn. So this is kind of a standard setup. I'm sure familiar to everyone here. In this setting, often at the high level, you want to take actions that kind of get you to a point where you are able to make good decisions in the long run. You could want to get kind of high reward in sample, or you could want to get high reward in the future. And okay, this is an algorithm you can run. I think when you're looking at this kind of algorithm, it's very natural to want to ask questions about it. Like, we're in a sequential experiment, we're kind of updating beliefs and then randomizing actions based on this belief distribution. What does the sample path of our beliefs look like in an algorithm like this? Do we learn quickly, slowly? Do our beliefs oscillate? And so forth. Other questions you might ask. Here's kind of a specific question I'll focus on here, just to kind of, in most of this talk, just to have something concrete to talk about, is what is the sampling distribution of regret? So we run this algorithm for n time steps. There's some reward you could have gotten by always pulling the best arm. What is the kind of excess loss you incurred from not knowing what the best time was a priori, and sometimes pulling the wrong arm during your during the experiment. So you might want distributional characterizations on regret. You might want to know what the mean regret is, and so forth. So these are questions of the type, I think it's pretty uncontroversial that we want to be able to answer questions like this. But okay, what does it mean to answer some of these questions? You could try to answer it in different ways. You could try to get bound, worst case guarantees, approximation results. So here, kind of, I guess, the way in what counts as an answer to this question may depend on kind of where you're coming from. My background, kind of my grad school training is in statistics. So just as a warm-up, I wanted to talk about an example. What's a very simple question that we know well how to answer, and what does a good answer look like? And kind of, when I was in grad school training, like what counted as a good answer is something like this. Let's say you wanted to ask about the sample mean. So you had n independent samples drawn from a distribution P, and you wanted to ask, what is the distribution of a sample mean? Well, what you can show is that the sample mean satisfies the central limit theorem. So the sample mean is roughly is distributed around the mean of y, with a variance that scales as 1 over n, and a distribution that's roughly Gaussian. And this is a limit result, but it's also actually a very good approximation result. And kind of what you learn in applied statistics calls is that kind of this central limit theorem is most of what you need to know in very many settings if you want to understand what methods work, what don't work, what are failure modes you should worry about, what do you think is going to happen when you do applied data analysis. So this is kind of, when I ask these questions here, kind of what is a sampling distribution of regret? What do sample paths of beliefs look like? The type of answer I'd hope for something like this, like something given by a limit theorem, but where the limiting object somehow is very sharp, and it gives us kind of good intuition for what happens in practice. So, okay, let's say we wanted to do this with sequential experiments, and here things get a little tricky. So the central limit theorem is a large sample result. So first, the natural question to ask is kind of what does the literature on kind of large sequential experiments look like? And there are some very nice results here. Just two highlights on these slides is first this classical kind of foundational result from Lai and Robbins. What they show is that when you're running a sequential experiment, and if you fix the reward distribution, then as you send the number of time steps to infinity, the optimal regret is going to scale like log the number of time steps. This log here means that kind of eventually you're going to learn which action is best. You're going to pull that action. This is going to kind of asymptotically happen very quickly. And then you're going to incur very small excess regret once you get past some critical horizon. So this kind of paints a very optimistic picture of the large sample or regret properties of sequential experiments. On the other hand, if you take a pessimistic point of view, fix n and then find a data generating distribution that makes a regret as bad as possible, then there are these well-known lower bounds from Howard et al., where kind of once you fix the horizon n, there you can always find a data generating distribution for which you're going to incur regret at least on the order of root n. So both of these results on their own kind of are very helpful. The Lai and Robbins result tells you that kind of fix any problem. Eventually, you're going to learn what the best arm is, and then it's smooth sailing from there on out. Our adult tell you, like kind of for any sample size, there are some distributions for which kind of you're going to incur a lot of regret. But kind of those are very helpful conceptually. But let's say now I'm wearing my kind of applied data analysis hat, and I'm consulting for a company who's preparing to run a sequential experiment with sample size n equals 100,000. What should I say? What should I say they should expect the regret distribution to be? What should I say they should expect the sample path of beliefs to look like? And here, right, like log n is not square root n, right? From a practical perspective, with 100,000 samples, should we expect regret to be more on the order of 5 or more on the order of 300? But this is a distinction that matters. You know, when you look at it like this, then it's kind of clear we haven't answered the question I asked earlier yet. We did some asymptotics. We took n to infinity. We learned a lot by taking n to infinity. But this wasn't enough to get kind of a useful approximation theorem in the sense that the central limit theorem gave us a useful approximation theorem when we were studying the sample mean. Right, the Lai and Robbins result is like very helpful in giving insight into the nature of the sequential learning problem. But the fact that kind of you can take their asymptotics and log n and root n are very different, kind of whether you took their kind of asymptotic or worst case point of view, suggests that these results aren't so helpful necessarily for doing finite sample analysis. So you could ask what went wrong. Is it that asymptotics with sequential experiments are just a bad idea? Or not just a bad idea, but like don't give helpful approximation results? Is it that sequential experiments are just too hard? Or is it that we could have taken different limits and that would have helped us? So essentially, in this talk, I'm going to argue for the latter thing, that kind of limit theory is helpful for sequential experiments. But if you want to kind of use limit theorems for the purpose of approximation, you should take a different limit. And then when you take a different limit, you end up with a diffusion, and that this diffusion is going to be helpful as an approximation. That'll let us answer the questions kind of I highlighted earlier on. So before kind of saying anything else, I just wanted to kind of emphasize what is the kind of type of limit we're talking about today. So we're going to still have k-arms, and we're going to run k-arm sequential experiments, except now, instead of fixing a reward distribution and sending the sample size to infinity, we're going to consider a systems of sequence indexed by n, where kind of the distribution, the reward distributions also depend on n. We're going to make the signal sizes weaker as we get more data, so the problem doesn't get too easy as you have a lot of data. And specifically, we're going to scale the problems so that the mean reward from any arm decays as 1 over root n as you move to the nth problem, whereas the variance is of constant order. Right. This is the setting we're going to focus on. And the claim is that kind of once you try to do asymptotics, but you use this kind of sequence of system scaling as opposed to a fixed reward distribution n to infinity scaling, the kind of discrepancy between the Lion-Robbins type asymptotics and worst case lower bound goes away. And we actually get a limit object that will be helpful for approximation purposes. Before kind of going in further, I just wanted to pause briefly if there are any questions at this point.
Maybe a clarification, or just to sort of defend Lion-Robbins a bit, you are ignoring the KL divergence term they had in the denominator. So is the claim that they're not sort of formally showing that if you jointly change the distribution, then you get a valid limit, or?
Yeah, I mean, the Lion-Robbins result was kind of, it's a very specific thing. You only get this discrepancy if you kind of look at it with the lens of looking. I mean, I think the Lion-Robbins result is very helpful for kind of understanding the difficulty of the problem. I guess the kind of the weakest thing I'd say about this is that I want an approximation result. In many problem settings, when you take n to infinity, you kind of automatically land on this limit object that is a very helpful approximation for finite sample behavior. And that kind of, in the Lion-Robbins framework, taking n to infinity doesn't give you that kind of asymptotic behavior. And that this Lion-Robbins result is also representative of kind of a lot of asymptotic work in sequential experiments more broadly. Any other questions? Cool. All right. So yeah, I guess I still have one slide here about the motivation for this. So why would we want to have these kind of reward as decay as 1 over root n? At first glance, it might seem surprising, but it actually has very strong precedent kind of across a number of fields. Kind of, in a sense, everything that kind of uses heavy traffic asymptotics in queuing theory, there's a very similar kind of scaling trip happening there, and they are going to land on a diffusion limit also. And actually kind of in statistics, this kind of local asymptotic normality limits of experiments theory going back to Latam also looks very similar. You have more data, you scale down the signal sizes by 1 over root n, and then you get a Gaussian limit experiment that you can study. So this has strong precedence. And also kind of just two kind of qualitative arguments for why this might be interesting. If you're running a sequential experiment with horizon 1,000,000, then probably it's because you needed roughly 1,000,000 samples to be on the order of magnitude of being able to detect effects that were interesting. This means that probably if you ran an experiment with a horizon of 1,000,000, you had effect sizes on the order of 1 over square root 1,000,000, because those are kind of effects that you need 1,000,000 samples to detect. So this is kind of an asymptotic regime that kind of tries to align effect sizes with kind of effect sizes that would be interesting given the horizon you specified. And the other thing is that if you're looking at kind of these worst case bounds, to achieve these bounds, you actually need to pick problems that look a lot like the scaling we're using here. So kind of, I think again, when you talk to people who work with bandit algorithms, like this is a very natural scaling to look at if you want to kind of make bandits have to work hard. So, okay. So,
excuse me. Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to make sure I'm with you here. So if the rate of convergence was faster than 1 over root n, then you just wouldn't be able to distinguish these guys with a computational budget of n samples.
That's exactly right.
Right, and if it was bigger than 1 over root n, then effectively it's very much like the sort of current context where they're not changing as a function of n.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think that there's actually a lot of interesting stuff to say in this in-between region. I believe actually Peter Glynn has a student who's kind of looking at some of these questions. But yeah, the root n scale is that's the scale where kind of the signals are big enough that they matter, but small enough that they're hard to find. And this is where you're gonna kind of incur the worst regret. Any more questions at this point? All right. So far I've been kind of pretty hand wavy about what I mean by a sequential experiment. Kind of talked about Thompson sampling, but also argued more generally. For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to try to work in the context of sequential experiments generally, but I'm going to assume 2 things about the sequential experiments. First, that it's randomized. That is that kind of at each time step, the way the agent chooses which arm to pull next is that they actually choose a probability distribution over all the arms and then take a random draw from this probability distribution. Thompson sampling and other things are obviously randomized in this sense. And second, I'm going to assume that this is Markovian in the following sense, that let QKI be the number of times you've pulled arm K up to time step I, and let SKI be the total reward you've gotten by pulling from arm K up to time step I. So these are 2 kind of obvious metrics you care about: how much you pulled an arm, how much reward you've gotten from that arm, that you'd want to kind of take into account when choosing what to do next. What we're going to assume is actually that these PIs, these action distributions, only depend on the past via QKI, or 1 step back, but via QK and SK. That you kind of can't have a more complicated dependence on the past. And we're going to call a sequential experiment that satisfies these randomization and Markovian conditions a sequentially randomized Markov experiment. And what's kind of nice about this construction is that the specification of a sequentially randomized Markov experiment depends entirely on what we call a sampling function psi. It's essentially the thing that takes your state variables Q and S and turns it into an action, a distribution over actions pi. All right. And this kind of object psi is going to feature heavily in the results a couple slides from now. So this is kind of an abstract setting. The claim is that it actually captures the behavior of many algorithms you'd actually want to run. So first, of course, there's Thompson sampling. Thompson sampling doesn't in general need to fit into this framework, right? Bayesian inference in general may use past data in kind of complicated ways, but it turns out the types of Thompson sampling people actually use do fit with us in this paradigm. So say if you run Thompson sampling with a conjugate prior, then the posterior distribution is only going to depend on these kind of QK and SK sufficient statistics. So you're in good shape. Other things that satisfy this are exploration sampling. This is kind of a smoothed version of top-to Thompson sampling. It is an alternative to Thompson sampling when you care about best arm identification. Then other things, they're kind of these heuristic decision rules that have been studied in behavioral economics, tempered greedy sampling. These are all things, like there are a lot of things you might care about that fit into this framework. The main limitation of this framework, like the 2 things that don't fit into this naturally, are first kind of methods for adversarial bandits. But the claim is, I think, kind of, if we wanted to work with adversarial bandits, you need to redo the theory for the adversarial setting. But my I think everything should go kind of like natural definitions adapted to the adversarial setting should cover something like X3. The other thing that's not covered by this is UCB. I think that's a bigger problem. UCB is not randomized in this sense. You kind of deterministically pick your action, not via drawing probabilities. So that's a little further from the theory I'm going to present here. But all right, so we have diffusion scaling of experiments. We have sequentially randomized Markov experiments. We need one last thing to get a diffusion limit. And this is that kind of our sequential experimentation scheme has to kind of be aligned with the diffusion asymptotics we're using. And remember, the key object that defined our a sequential experiment was the sampling function. The sampling function was the thing that looked how many times you pull each arm, what your rewards are, and maps that to kind of action probabilities. And what we need is for this to be convergent, meaning that kind of in the nth, as you move to the nth problem, if you observe n times more data, n times more draws from a given arm, and you observe root n times more rewards for that arm, then kind of your decision kind of remains the same. So essentially, there's going to be some kind of limiting scaled number of draws and reward in that arm. And this kind of, and the kind of natural scaling would be that you want to divide your number of draws by n and your rewards by root n. And the sampling functions being convergent mean that they respect the scaling as the sample size gets large. And given this setting, our main result is that under diffusion asymptotics, so under a scaling where the reward, mean reward decays 1 over root n, and with a convergent sequence of sampling functions, then sequentially randomized Markov experiments converge to a diffusion limit. There are some more technical conditions. We're going to assume that the limiting function psi is Lipschitz continuous, and we're going to assume some kind of uniformity over the convergence of these sampling functions. But that's the main idea.
I'm sorry, Stefan, please. One of the things that was notably absent from your assumption about the way this proceeds is that you're not relying on the second moments of the observations. Please?
Yes, there are going to be. So yeah, I didn't. So the second moments are going to be. So the scaling is going to be so that the first moments decay as 1 over root n. The second moments are of constant order, and the fourth moments are bounded.
Right, but your policies are not relying on, say, the sample standard deviations or sample variances of the arm pools.
No. That is, yeah. Right here, it's the example I'm going to show later is going to be kind of Thompson sampling, where you kind of assume that you know the kind of the standard deviation of the outcomes of the rewards a priori.
Okay, so with that assumption, I just want to understand why it's excluded. I guess it's you've got to be able to make progress on the problem. Is that kind of the main reason? Or? So
there's also this. So kind of when we say that this setting is quite general, right? Like other stuff could go in terms of psi. It's just kind of what this doesn't allow you to do is to kind of be kind of learning a second moment parameter and kind of plugging in an updated second moment parameter into here. And what ends up happening here is kind of in the limit we're assuming, so where we have more and more draws, where the variance is constant order, but the mean shrinks, then actually learning the variance becomes trivial, right? Like in the limit, you instantly know what the true variance is.
True. Oh, I see. So, I mean, your policy is not allowed to use that information, though, by the looks of things.
It is. I mean, we could kind of implicitly, so we could have like psi depend on the true variance here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I see where you're going. So it can depend on the true variance, and in the limiting regime where you're exploring, it's effectively like you're learning that.
Exactly.
Thank you. That helps.
Thanks. Yeah, but yeah, that is definitely one aspect that kind of gets washed out by the limit. And
can I ask another question? So why did you say why the UCB does not fall within this framework?
Yeah, so in the proof, what ends up mattering a lot is this kind of randomized aspect of the decision rule. That's kind of given a certain reward distribution, or kind of given a certain number of draws from different arms, and given certain rewards you've gotten so far, then you might be like, at this point, I'm going to pull arm 1 with probability 70%, arm 2 with probability 20%, and arm 3 with probability 10%.
So there is a particular condition, assume that pi I is not concentrated at a single point, single arm. That's a great question. Where does UCB break? UCB is not going to satisfy this condition. That kind of your probabilities vary in a Lipschitz, your kind of actions choices vary in a Lipschitz way in terms of your state. Well, that depends on in what metric, right? Or size kind of takes values in a distribution, right? Somewhere.
Yeah, so here psi is the thing that maps kind of the number of times you've pulled each arm and the reward you've gotten from each arm to a decision rule.
To a distribution.
Yeah. And the problem would be like UCB kind of, maybe if your reward for arm 1 was 1.001, you just don't pull it. But if your average reward was 1.002, then now you pull it all the time. And you have this discontinuity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. I think like
just to follow up, I mean, if you did a softmax and then kind of change the parameter to depend on t, like,
yes.
Can you get UCB as a limit of something like that?
Running something like softmax UCB would be totally fine. So yeah, that would work. That would work well. Where kind of, yeah, instead of kind of looking at the sharp upper end point of the distribution, you kind of, something that would work is like you have a confidence interval and then you take a draw from that confidence interval and you pick the largest draw, or something like that, which kind of smooths the actions. That would work. All right. And so then kind of in this setting, so what are we going to do? I talked about scaling earlier. So essentially first, as we move to the nth problem, we're going to divide the number of draws in each arm by n. We're going to divide the rewards by 1 over root n. And then we're going to scale time. So then kind of the ith data point, kind of t time is going to be like I over n. So time is going to go from 0 to 1. And then kind of what we're going to study is this kind of scaled process with kind of time change. And the result is that this kind of rescaled process converges weakly to the solution of a stochastic differential equation, where the stochastic differential equation looks like this. And what do we see here? Well, we see a Brownian motion, and we see this thing psi, the sampling function. And otherwise, kind of, it's a pretty simple form that just kind of Q and S evolve in a way that's driven by psi and the standard Brownian motion. So the claim is that this stochastic differential equation is something that's tractable, and that's something that kind of is a useful approximation result, approximation object that kind of, if you want to understand what is it that Thompson sampling or any other sequentially randomized Markov experiment is doing, you can just kind of look at this SDE and get insights out of it. Does this make sense, everyone? So this is the SDE representation. What I'm going to do for the remainder of the talk is kind of do a deep dive on Thompson sampling in the 1 and 2 arm cases and kind of look at what are implications of this SDE form. Before doing that, I just wanted to kind of mention one thing. This is kind of a helpful way of re-representing this SDE. You can also write the behavior of the sample path in terms of an ODE driven by a Brownian motion, right? So here, essentially what we're gonna have is, here W is a Brownian motion, and you can kind of fix it, and then we show that S and Q evolve by the following system that's driven by this random Brownian motion. And at least to me, this is a little less helpful in terms of understanding what the experiment is doing, but in terms of kind of deriving insights, formal insights in the 1 and 2 arm cases, this is very helpful.
Can I ask another question? Sorry. So will we see actually, so does this limiting result contain both the logarithmic regret and the square root regret within it as sort of special cases?
No, so we're only going to have the square root regret in here. Okay. Because essentially the way you get logarithmic regret is you have to fix the distribution, and then you need to kind of reach this point of separation, right? Where you need to reach this point where you can actually distinguish the arms from each other. And at that point, you start incurring very, very little regret. Here we kind of a priori chose to focus on the setting where the gap between the arms decays 1 over root n. So everything we're doing now is going to be root n scale. But the claim is that kind of the root n scale, that's the regime where kind of what you do matters a lot. That's probably the regime where you care about being the most careful. And kind of when you're in the root n regime, with this SDE is going to give you its exact distributional results and exact constants.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions here? All right. So, okay. So now I think at this point it got pretty abstract. So let's talk about a concrete case. 1-arm bandit Thompson sampling. So what do I mean by 1-arm bandit? I mean that there's an agent that at each time step has only 2 choices. You can either draw a sample or not draw a sample. If you draw a sample, you get a draw from a distribution Pn with mean mu n and variance sigma n, and you get reward mu n. If you don't draw, you do nothing and receive 0 reward. And we're going to assume, as always, a diffusion scaling. So the mean reward decays is 1 over root n, and the noise scale sigma remains constant. So this is the setting. How are we going to run this experiment? We're going to run Thompson sampling. This is a kind of popular Bayesian heuristic that essentially starts by assuming that the problem instance is drawn from some prior distribution. At each step, you use the data you've observed so far to update your posterior, and then you draw actions from a distribution that depends on the posterior, kind of your posterior beliefs about what action is best. So this is how we're going to sample here. And there's really, once you've written the problem like this, there's really only one question, and that is, what prior should you use for Thompson sampling, right? Because Thompson sampling starts with the prior beliefs over the rewards that then you can update. Where do you start from? We're going to use a Gaussian prior here. That's going to give us conjugacy and mean that we kind of fit in the sequentially randomized Markov experiments framework. We just need to pick the prior variance, And how should we pick this? So a first very natural thought is that if we think we have effect sizes that are decaying as 1 over root n, then we should also kind of scale the prior standard deviation down by 1 over root n, the prior variance down by 1 over n, and kind of scale the prior variance in this kind of way, so we kind of get this limiting precision parameter C for the prior. You could do this. You can check that in this case, all the conditions of the main theorem are satisfied, and that here our main result kind of immediately implies that we have a diffusion limit for one-arm Thompson sampling, that you can kind of, the most important thing is here, how many times did you draw this arm? The following kind of ODE, different Brownian motion, is the thing you want to be looking at. And kind of from the objects defined here, you can also read off your reward distribution. So this is very nice. You can do it. But then we started comparing this to kind of what people actually do in the literature often. And this scaling is actually not what people do in the literature. This is the scaling you would have thought if you took the Bayesian interpretation of Thompson sampling seriously, and you kind of tried to pick priors that were roughly on the same scale as the signals you're modeling. But if you look at what people actually do, for example, in this inferential paper by Agrawal and Goyal, is kind of, as you're moving along, you just set this prior variance to 1 or some amount, and you actually don't rescale the prior variance as you increase the sample size, which in our case, there shouldn't be a C here, just ends up meaning this, that kind of, instead of converging to a C, when you kind of rescale the precision of the prior, you converge to 0. 0 here means that the prior is kind of washes out in the limit, and that you kind of don't regularize at all in the limit. We're going to call this the undersmoothed regime. And so this is also something you can look at. What's trickier is that actually in this regime, the limiting sampling function isn't Lipschitz anymore, so our main result doesn't apply directly, but kind of a direct argument based on what I told you earlier shows that actually things still work, and that kind of as you take C to 0, you converge to a nice limiting object, and that this nice limiting object is a strong solution to kind of what you hope it would be. That is this ODE, which is the same ODE as before, but with C equals 0. If you stare at this for long enough, you notice here kind of W is a standard Brownian motion. Here you're taking kind of, this is like WT divided by root T. We know that this is a weird object that blows up near 0. So kind of you stare at this, you might be a little worried. What is going on? This seems like a very unstable object, but okay. It has strong solutions, and as you take C to 0, the solutions we got kind of in the smooth regime converge to one of them. So, okay, you could do this. Are these approximations any good? I'll just show you quickly. We kind of simulated with n equals 1,500 actual Thompson sampling versus kind of the limit process we got from kind of reading off these ODEs driven by Brownian motions. What these pictures show is kind of a distribution of the reward process in both settings, and one can't see any difference. So that's encouraging. This is kind of both in the C equals 0 and C equals 1 regimes. So the limit seems okay. But now kind of what's very interesting is once we have these limits, we were looking at the one-arm Thompson sampling problem, maybe can we actually get further insights? I showed that kind of for any way you scale the regularization, I can give you a diffusion limit. But now what's a good way of scaling the regularization? How should we choose the prior variance to minimize regret? Is smoothing or undersmoothing better? What do samples passive Thompson sampling look like? I've been asking this a lot. Finally, we're in a position to answer it. Maybe just this is something I didn't have a strong intuition about before. Just if we take a quick poll, if between kind of like smoothing or undersmoothing, what do you think is better? So just as a quick reminder, smoothing means that kind of we take the story where we believe kind of that Thompson sampling is a Bayesian algorithm seriously. So now we know we're working in a scaling where effect sizes decay with n. So we want to also think hard about what prior we're going to use. And we're going to use a sequence of priors whose variance also decays as 1 over n. And in the smoothing paradigm, you could imagine that we're going to think hard about what effect sizes we're interested in and pick a prior that reflects those. So that's one thing we could do. The other thing is like the undersmooth thing is essentially following Agarwal and Goyal and just don't think about it too hard. Set a prior variance to 1. In our regime, this prior variance is way too big. So this is almost going to be like using a kind of improper flat prior for Thompson sampling, and then go from there. So what do you think is kind of the better general principle for this? Think hard about what the prior variance should be and use smooth sampling, or don't think about it and use undersmoothing. If anyone thinks smoothing is better, can you raise your hands?
I mean, how are you deciding what the two arms are?
I'm gonna show you kind of what regret looks like afterwards, and we're gonna say that one regime is better than the other if kind of for interesting problems it gives lower regrets. So
maybe I'm questioning what's the interesting problem. So are you choosing the two in a way such that they're very close to each other, or are you sort of sampling them like from a true prior? Does that matter?
Okay, I mean, I guess I'm being nebulous, but it's like if you, and maybe here I'm asking something that's nebulous, but it's like if one were actually doing data analysis in a problem one cared about. Should one do the Bayesian thing and think about the prior, or should one not do the Bayesian thing and just set the prior to be flat?
So
we got 1 vote from Nathan in favor of smoothing.
I would say smoothing as well.
Any votes in favor of undersmoothing? Yeah,
I go undersmoothing.
Okay, we have 2 votes also in favor of undersmoothing. When we looked at this, when we were writing this first, when we got to this point, I was very happy, and I was like, here's how we should wrap up the paper. Obviously, smoothing is better, so we should just find the value of C that gives us minimax regret, and then be like, right in the abstract, we used our diffusion scaling to show that the optimal amount of smoothing for Thompson sampling from minimax point of view is the following. But then we actually made these plots. How does regret vary with the sample size? And here, so it's a 1-arm bandit. So remember, mu is kind of the mean reward from the arm you're drawing. If mu is positive, then the arm is good. You'd want to kind of pull the arm as much as possible. If mu is negative, the arm is bad. You'd prefer not pulling the arm. And then kind of here, mu equals 5 actually means that when you're in the nth problem, your reward is going to be mu divided by 1 over, it's going to be 5 divided by root n. And the variance of the rewards is 1 here. So here, we're plotting regret for different values of C. Kind of lighter colors are for kind of larger values of C, so for more smoothing. And in black, you see C equals 0, the undersmooth thing. So the first thing you see here is, this was really a surprise to me, undersmoothing doesn't break anything in this regime. I thought undersmoothing would be living like way up here. It's not. It's giving something totally reasonable. What's more actually, when the arm you're pulling is the bad arm, out of all the options I showed you here, setting C equals 0 is just better uniformly, regardless of what the truth is. So like if the true signal is like -5, and I put a prior that was kind of tuned to the case where like the true signal would be around 5, I'm actually better off, instead of kind of thinking about the prior, I was better off just undersmoothing and using C equals 0 here. In the case where mu is positive, this doesn't occur. And here kind of this equals 0 case. It's not the worst, it's not the best, it's somewhere in between. But in the when the arm is negative, C equals 0 is actually kind of uniformly the best. So this was kind of very surprising to us. And then we kind of try to see, can we kind of give a more formal separation result or kind of understanding of like, is C equals 0 kind of special relative to other stuff? And the way we studied this is we looked at what we kind of called the super diffusive regime, which is kind of, here we're taking two limits. First, we're taking a sequence of problems where we're kind of scaling the effect size as 1 over root n. And now within the scaling, we're going to make the effect size very big. So here we're looking at problems where kind of the reward is something big divided by root n. And we're going to look at kind of how this root n scale regret varies as we make the signal size big. And here, what turns out is that if you use C equals 0, then kind of good things happen. The stronger the signal, the smaller your regret. This is kind of in line with intuition we'd get from kind of Lion Robbins and so forth, meaning that kind of what's hard in bandit problems is when you don't have separation. Once you get separation, you can figure out what the good arm is and you can pull it. You're in good shape. But this is not what happens when you set C bigger than 0, when you use smoothing. Kind of, if you use any amount of smoothing, and then you send the signal size to infinity, then actually regret can get unboundedly large, as opposed to decaying to 0, as you'd hope should happen once you start having margin. In the one-arm case, this only occurs when you send the arm reward to negative infinity. It doesn't occur when you send a kind of reward to plus infinity. But the reason this happens is essentially that kind of if you use any amount of smoothing, when you have a very bad arm, you're not able to shut down the arm fast enough, and you just pay huge regret. So this was kind of a surprise to me, that first in terms of just kind of looking at the plot, or second in terms of like trying to look at scaling, what happens with kind of strong signals in our regime. It turns out that actually under smoothing is just much more robust than smoothing. So that was strange. But so then you might ask, okay, if under smoothing is so good, is it that when we looked at this diffusion characterization of under smooth Thompson sampling, it looked like it was very unstable, but was somehow our intuition off, that actually it was stable and just the form of this kind of looked scary. But it turns out that actually this is not true either. Kind of under smooth Thompson sampling achieves low regret, but it does so in a very weird way. It doesn't do so at all in a way like you'd hope out of a proper Bayesian heuristic, where you kind of have beliefs that update in a sort of martingale kind of way that converge to something nice. No, actually kind of in the under smooth regime, your belief process will be kind of horribly unstable, and actually kind of the following result holds. Kind of regardless of how strong the true signal is, at some point along the sample path, Thompson sampling will be arbitrarily convinced that the signal has the opposite sign. So if the one arm you have is good, no matter how good it is, at some point during the sample path, Thompson sampling will be arbitrarily convinced that the arm is bad. So this seems kind of very odd. And then you might say, like, surely this is bad, and under smooth Thompson sampling is just a bad algorithm. But it's like, no, it actually recovers. Yeah, anyways. So here are some kind of paths showing the evolution of sampling probabilities of Thompson sampling with kind of for a good arm and a bad arm. And you just see kind of, especially at the beginning of time, there's just like a huge oscillation. And here we have this one weird path when in a situation where the arm reward is +3, so the arm is obviously a good one. But here there's this one weird path where kind of for the whole horizon, Thompson sampling is convinced the arm is bad and doesn't pull it much at all. And you could be like, how could you possibly get good regret properties out of an algorithm that does strange things like this? But it's like, it happens, but like it happens early on the path, but usually the algorithm recovers fast enough that this doesn't actually make you pay in the regret metric, and you land on your feet. So anyways, that was kind of, in short, some things about what's going on in the diffusion scaling for the one-arm bandit. Any questions at this point? I think I'm probably pretty much out of time. So there are kind of many interpretations here, like how this connects to like minimax rates for learning in bandits. Happy to talk about offline. The one thing I wanted to show is here I showed results for the one-arm bandit because it's kind of the easiest one to study, but you can run similar things for the two-arm bandit. And in the one-arm bandit, we saw that kind of if you have one arm that's a good arm, smoothing can sometimes help. But if you have a bad arm, then smoothing is always bad. In the two-arm case, there's less equivocation. There's actually kind of uniformly over the arm gaps. Here you see the C equals 0 regret curve. It's just C equals 0 is just best. It's actually, as far as I can tell, it's not literally best. Like some of these other curves go below it at some point, as far as I can tell. From we don't have a formal result, but kind of to what you can see, kind of within the thickness of the curves. Said just under smoothing is almost instance wise optimal for two-arm Thompson sampling. And kind of a similar result holds again as you get large. All these other curves corresponding to smooth stuff, when you move up way up here, they're going to start curving up, whereas the black curve corresponding to under smoothing is going to keep going down as the arm gap increases. All right. In the interest of time, there's kind of, I skipped the slides on kind of how this relates to kind of minimax guarantees for learning. I'm happy to take questions on that, but I'm going to wrap up now, so I close within the hour. So this talk was about a diffusion framework for studying sequential experiments. And really the hope is that this kind of diffusion scaling gives you a limit object you can use to study Thompson sampling and other sequential experiments. Gives a useful approximation and can give us kind of new insights and kind of guidance about what to do with practice with this kind of algorithm. So thanks, happy to take any questions.
In the interest of others, I will, I guess, clap. You can imagine the audience. Yeah, I guess we have time for a few questions. So,
can I ask a question? Did you also run, like, look at the sample paths for the smooth case, and do they look a lot smoother than the plots that you showed us for the C equals 0 case?
Yeah, they look smoother. They look. I mean, there's some point where you can, if you smooth a lot, like once you start putting C to like 2, 4, they start looking a lot smoother. But that's the regime where kind of regret starts looking really, really bad. So.
Do you have an explanation for why you think the C equals 0 case, even when the algorithm becomes very convinced in the opposite direction, it somehow recovers?
Why it recovers? I mean, yes and no. It's essentially all in here, right? Kind of, the question is to understand properties of this ODE. And honestly, it's one of these things where, like, taking the diffusion approximation, you took this kind of bandit problem. It seems like kind of this hard, kind of modern probability problem. You get the diffusion limit, you get this object. Like, how bad could this be? Like, studying this is just calculus. But still, kind of, this is weird, right? Because you have this ODE is driven by this thing that's highly oscillatory and does weird stuff near 0. But essentially, the reason bad things don't happen is that this ODE is going to have this kind of, its drift rate is going to oscillate a lot, but it's still going to kind of eventually grow. Like you could worry that this drift rate would kind of go up and down, and some point it would go so far down that it just gets stuck and never climb back up. But somehow the properties of the kind of rescaled Brownian motion just are such that this thing won't get stuck and it'll keep going, even if it kind of has some patches where it moves very slow. But yeah, thanks. That's a very good question. I wish I had like a more intuitive answer here, but this is all I've got for now, at least.
No, thank you. This is very interesting.
So that sample path behavior where you basically stay well clear of, you're allergic to, the right arm for some time is a little concerning, right? And so is there some way to quantify the time when it does this turnaround?
I imagine there ought to be, right? I guess what you'd want is something like, in this kind of picture, you have these sample paths that oscillate, but like there's some moment in time where like after this moment in time, like usually weird stuff doesn't happen anymore. That would be an interesting result. We don't have that yet. But in terms of this oscillation, actually one kind of pet direction I'd want to take this, even though I haven't done so yet, is kind of actually consider this as like a behavioral model for learning. Like if we actually think that there's some difficult thing, like the scientific community is trying to learn about like good nutrition or something like that. It's just a hard problem with weak signals, where kind of people are going to want to go with the thing that seems right at the time. Like if we looked at Thompson sampling as like a behavioral model for nutrition science or something comparable, the kind of prediction of this model would be that like at times we'd be just arbitrarily wrong about what's healthy or not healthy, and everyone would be doing the unhealthy thing for a while, but that eventually we'd figure out like, oops, we messed up, and then kind of move on. So yeah, in a way it seems concerning, but then at least for me, the more I think about it, the more it just like seems concerning, but also kind of familiar in terms of how actual things go down.
I guess let's thank Stefan again. I sort of see what everyone was talking about. And we were excited.
Thanks everyone
for having you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Good, thanks.